Now, it's the Law Show on CISL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Good morning. Welcome to the Law Show here on CISL 650. It's a pleasure to welcome a couple of personal injury lawyers to the program today from Murphy Battista LLP here in Vancouver. It's a pleasure to say good morning and welcome to Scott Stanley and to Bill Dick. Scott, good morning.
Good morning, Sterling.
And Bill, good morning to you.
Good morning, sir.
Making the big trek down from the Okanagan to be with us again this week. That's darn brave of you. Thank you for that.
To the big smoke.
That's right. Now, Bill, you're a Vancouver guy, but you moved up to the Okanagan, 8 or 9 years ago now?
About 8 years ago, I moved from Vancouver to the Okanagan, yeah.
All right. Now, you have been with Murphy Battista, however, for a matter of a couple of months, right?
Not even that. So, about a month now.
Okay. And why did you migrate to Murphy Battista, and where were you before when up in the Okanagan?
It's a long story. It's a long story that has a lot to do with the person sitting next to me, Scott. Scott and I worked together for years in Vancouver at a firm that did sort of high-level insurance defense work. And,
okay.
And I actually brought him over to that firm. And about a year and a half ago, Scott called me wanting to put the band back together, as he referred to it. And we've always kind of missed working together. So we just ultimately, it took a while, but we ultimately just made that reality happen by setting up a Murphy Battista office in the Okanagan where I live. And so I'm part of the Murphy Battista crew now, and we get to work together again.
How does it feel? What's the change for you like, Bill, having gone that 180 from representing the insurance companies, the big insurance companies, and now you don't do anything but individuals and personal injury? What's that like for you as a guy, as a lawyer?
Well, let's just say karma. It's good for my soul.
I'll bet.
No, I mean, I think from my perspective, two things. One, I think I'm a much better plaintiff's lawyer having practice on the other side and understanding ultimately how insurance companies function, what their strategies are, what they find compelling ultimately to resolve a claim on behalf of a plaintiff. So on that front, I think from my perspective, I think I'm a much better plaintiff's lawyer. But more
because
importantly,
of those years of experience inside the other guy's playbook, right?
And more importantly, I think just from my own personal perspective, my own sort of the nature of who I am, I find it far, far more satisfying representing individuals who ultimately need your help. And I just find that way more satisfying than working for a large insurance company.
Not difficult to imagine at all, Bill. And Scott, you went through that whole thing as well, a few years ahead of Bill, but nonetheless going, again, the full circle from wearing the black hat to the white hat, one might say, using a kind of a TV Western analogy. But talk about changing your life, huh?
It does. You go from representing an insurance company that doesn't have the ability to express an emotion to clients that do that all the time. And, I did defense work for 13 years, 14 years, never lost a trial, never once got a thank you card. And who cares? Who cares about a lawyer's feelings? But I've been doing this work now for about 7 years exclusively, and the number of thank you cards and gifts and emails that are just appreciative of the good work that we try to do for our clients, it's just absolutely overwhelming.
Right.
You go from clients that have no emotion to those that do. It's a wonderful thing.
Oh, if it's immensely satisfying if you can make a difference in someone's life, and not only the individual's life, but the family's life or whatever it is. It's immensely satisfying. And coming to Vancouver, I was at the airport, and I ran into the father of someone I represented. Hadn't seen him in a while.
Okay.
And he came over to me and again said, I just want to thank you. You've made a huge difference in my son's life. And I can't tell you how satisfying that is on a human level.
Of course. Interesting stuff. Scott, when you assume the personal injury lawyer task, what have you found to be the most difficult cases to take on?
Geez, without a doubt, the most difficult cases are those involving mild brain injuries, concussion cases, because they're so controversial. There's very serious injuries like spinal cord injuries and orthopedic injuries that are very serious, but their injuries are obvious. Concussion cases or cases involving very complicated psychiatric conditions, those are the most complicated.
I suppose now, Joe Murphy told me a little story when he was with us a few months ago about how challenging it can be, and this for both of you, to deal with someone who has suffered a brain injury as a result of an accident or some other trauma. Because in many cases, Bill, the person will tell you, so how are you doing today? I'm fine. I'm just great. They don't know. They have no concept of how badly injured they are, and they think they're just fine. And so to try and convince them, let alone a jury or an insurance company, that they're not well and there's some serious problems going on here, some cases your client can be almost an impediment.
No, it's very true, particularly with mild traumatic brain injuries. Oftentimes, you are who you are. And so to the degree that you've changed, you don't actually recognize that in yourself.
Sure.
But, the spouse will say, oh my God, this person is completely different than before the accident. And the collateral witnesses become hugely important.
Right.
There's also a stigma attached to people who've suffered brain injuries that people don't want to acknowledge or recognize. They don't want to be known as someone who's brain injured because there's stigma attached. There shouldn't be, but there is.
Right.
And so oftentimes there's a denial factor as well as a failure to recognize that they've suffered the injury.
I want to talk to you about get into some hair splitting. Got two lawyers in the room. This is where the hair splitting gets to be fun. Talked about brain injury, Scott, and concussions. You used both those descriptive words in the same sentence. What is the difference between a concussion, a serious one, and a brain injury, or are they in fact the same thing?
Well, before I answer that, Bill will slap me for sinning because the two are not different. They're one and the same.
Oh, okay.
I probably shouldn't.
It's exactly the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So Bill can flog me later. But what a concussion is what we would call a mild brain injury. It's on the mild end of the scale. We basically rate them severe, moderate, and minor, and a concussion is a minor brain injury.
Okay.
Having said that, some of the people that have the worst outcomes, in my experience, are those that have these concussions because the symptoms are diffuse. They affect not just one part of the brain, but all parts of the brain. Whereas some of the more moderate and severe brain injuries, they focus on one part of the brain.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I suppose, though, it's complicated, too, Bill, by the fact that some of these people are injured, clearly are injured, and you can produce medical evidence to support that, but they look and act just fine, thank you. That could be confusing, especially for a jury.
Yeah, particularly with people with mild traumatic brain injuries. And oftentimes when you meet your clients, they appear to be absolutely fine. It's only when you talk to them for a lengthy period of time, or you talk to the people who are involved in their lives, that you may seem fine on the outside, but you realize that there are deficits in various different ways. Deficits in their personality, or deficits in their ability to multitask, or it can affect you in like Scott said, in a variety of different ways.
Right.
But they seem to be on first blush to be completely fine, but they're not. The other aspect, as Scott said, that are difficult cases are psychological cases where people suffer post-traumatic stress. Again, they appear to be fine, but they're not.
Right.
And you can't put that on an x-ray.
So now this comes down in many cases to an assessment on your part, because when you're approached by someone who's been in an accident, who has suffered some kind of injury, they come to you or one of your colleagues at Murphy Battista and say, look, I'm not the same. I got into this accident and things just haven't been the same. Can we talk? You very much would like for that first interview, for the person who has approached you to be accompanied by another person in their life. Correct, Scott?
Yeah, because one of the symptoms of a brain injury is a lack of insight. And often the people don't realize they have a problem until they've been repeatedly told by those that are close to them that they do.
Right.
And so usually,
even though they may not still believe them to this moment. Right.
Yeah, but I think it's important to have a really close family member, someone who's got good proximity to the person who's injured, so that you can, have the injured person leave the room and just say, like, okay, tell me what's different about this person. What are we dealing with here?
Right. Okay. And in that initial interview, how helpful is the input from the second person for you, Bill, particularly in terms of determining whether you're going to take this case on or not?
Well, it's a huge factor in terms of not whether you're going to take it on or not, but in assessing the degree to which this person has been injured. And you often don't get that from the injured person, like you said, in a mild traumatic brain injury, because there's lack of insight. Usually you can go through a number of checklists and ask about various symptoms that people have, and what you find quite often is that the spouse or the family member will go, yep, yes, yes, as you go through there, and they'll say this, there's been significant changes,
Right.
and you just don't get that insight unless you actually ask someone.
Right. Now, personal injuries, we've sort of, I typically approach personal injury and conversations with you folks from Murphy Battista. I sort of always relate to the conversation through the prism of the car accident, some kind of traumatic event, usually involving 4 tires. But it's not necessarily the case, because some of the other work you do is medical malpractice. And then you're talking about concussions, Scott. Concussions are now more prominent in the world of sport than ever before, mostly because we're aware of them, and as parents particularly, we don't want to see our children get messed up the way some have in previous generations. How much work that you do at the firm is involved with injuries resulting from a sports or an athletic event other than a car accident?
Usually not very many, because a lot of times when people are engaged in sport, there's no one's at fault, right? It's just one of the consequences of the game. But what I can say is having a greater awareness with concussions as they relate to sport has really impacted and influenced the way people that are injured in non-sports related situations when they have concussions. It's really advanced the research for those that have been injured in, say, for example, car accidents and slip and falls.
Okay, Bill, if I'm injured in a competition, suppose my beer league hockey team, and I get out there and I get really whacked, and I'm not quite the same. So I go to my doctor and I explain that this has gone on, and it's well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is if I'm on the team and I get out there and I'm hurt, I come back on the bench and the coach or the trainer comes over to me and says, "Whoa, you all right?" And the typical line is, "Well, yeah, I guess I got my bell rung a little out there. I'll be okay." And now they don't do that anymore. Now there's more to it. There's a concussion protocol. You have to go to a quiet room and all of that stuff. If I'm an athlete and I'm injured in that way and I'm not put through these concussion protocols, do I have a case?
You potentially may, and I'll give you an example. This isn't about whether there's adequate protocols, and certainly we're all aware of the recent class action suits out of the NFL, and now there's one out of the CFL.
Right.
There's NHL where players are complaining that there weren't protocols in place, that the doctors weren't adequately taking care of them. There was too much emphasis to put the players back on the ice way too early. There's lots of lawsuits that have arisen recently out of that. But I'm representing an RCMP officer who was involved in a beer league game where it's no contact, and this player slammed him headfirst into.
You find a few of those bozos in beer leagues, unfortunately. Yeah.
And so there is a potential claim, and unless you're in a professional sports avenue, oftentimes you don't have doctors and trainers. And,
of course not. No.
So there's no avenue to go after someone. But certainly the NHL players and the CFL players are now who have suffered significant head injuries and repeated concussions, and they were put back on the ice, are now commencing actions against the NHL and the individual organizations.
Yeah, those sports leagues, they don't have a problem because they don't have a legal problem because the sport causes a concussion. They have a problem because of the way they dealt and administered the treatments post-concussion,
right,
and the failure to disclose the risks to the players of the concussion, the nature and degree of the concussion.
Also, where they are guilty is they sent that guy back out onto the ice too soon, rather than And again, Bill's talking about the pressure of the game. Come on, this is the guy who sells all the tickets. Get him out there.
And they didn't share the information they had that suggests that these concussions have quite significant long-term impacts, especially with football players.
Right.
The real, the poster boy for this is Junior Seau, who was a vicious linebacker for the San Diego Chargers. And
I remember Junior,
New England Patriots. He played 20 years, never sustained a concussion, and shortly after he retired, he shot himself in the chest. They did an autopsy of his brain, and he had chronic CTE, which is just micro concussions. but never once diagnosed with a concussion in 20 years.
Interesting. And hard to believe that in that sport over 20 years, especially playing the position he did, he never got his bell rung, so to speak. And of course he did, probably every game.
Yep.
And so what you've got is a cumulative effect here. And Bill, in law, I know we need to take a break, and Dwayne's having kittens in there, but I got to ask you this part. In law, if it's that cumulative effect, is this the basis of these suits with these professional sports guys? I wasn't advised not to go back into the game. In fact, quite the opposite happened. Get out there. They want to see you. So is that the legal hook that they're hanging their hats on?
Well, they're ultimately saying that they were owed a duty of care, ultimately. And in order to establish liability, you have to establish that there was a duty of care owed in the first instance, and that the organizations didn't meet that duty of care. They owed them an obligation to give them that information, and they didn't. And ultimately, they were put back on the ice in a compromised situation, and it made their situations worse.
Okay, and for the parents listening and the grandparents and the godfathers and godmothers listening to the program right now on a Sunday morning, with maybe some of them heading out to the rink to watch Junior play hockey this afternoon, Scott, what sort of assurance do those people have, parents and relatives of little kids in Canadian sport these days, that sort of behavior just isn't allowed anymore?
Well, they should know, I mean, kids that are playing sports are going to have concussions. Good thing is 80 to 90% of them are going to make a full recovery.
Right.
People have that information now so that you and your children can make a decision about whether or not you're going to play these sports. Whereas 20 years ago, even 5 years ago, they didn't have that information. So at least they have the information, they're armed with the information, they could make these choices. And if your kid does get a concussion, they sit out.
Right. Okay.
People are far more educated now, which is great.
It's the old knowledge is power thing, isn't it? We're talking with our guest from Murphy Battista. It's personal injury law and, a little sports thrown in on the side here this morning on the Law Show. Our guests are Scott Stanley and Bill Dick, lawyers both from Vancouver and Kelowna, and we'll be talking more on the Law Show with our guests from Murphy Battista right after this timeout.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is the Law Show on CISL 650.